San Diego County is known for being one of America's most expensive regions. Locals are feeling the squeeze and looking for solutions. KPBS's new series, Price of San Diego, delves into the rising cost of groceries, childcare, car insurance, and even our beloved California burrito. You won't want to miss this ongoing series live now at kpbs.org/Price of San Diego.
Welcome in San Diego, it's Jade Hindman. On today's show, we'll discuss San Diego's role in the war with Iran, plus the influence of Christian nationalism. This is KPBS Midday Edition, connecting our communities through conversation. Welcome back to KPBS Midday Edition. I'm Jade Hindman. The American-Israeli war on Iran has entered its second week. More than 1,300 people have been killed in Iran, according to the Iranian Red Crescent Society. And over the weekend, a seventh U.S. service member was killed. Now, many fear this could be another forever war, pointing to parallels of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. My next guest explores that question, though, in his recent op-ed in the San Diego Union Tribune. He argues that San Diego's role in the war started long before this year. Ibrahim al-Marashi joins me now. He's a professor of Middle East history at Cal State San Marcos and visiting professor of journalism at San Diego State University. Professor, welcome back to Midday Edition.
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
So glad to have you here. Now, your op-ed is called San Diego's Key Role in the Forever War with Iran. Tell me, in short, what point were you trying to make with this piece?
The public is wary of entering another forever war with the recent strike on Iran. My argument is we haven't noticed, but during the first Trump administration, the U.S., particularly the San Diego area, and its naval fleet had been deployed in a low-intensity war with Iran. We just never paid attention. And then the events of COVID more or less prevented that war from escalating.
Well, I want to dig into some of the issues in more detail here, because you argue that San Diego's connection to this war goes back as far as 2019. Tell me a bit more about that.
So if we look at a timeline, the U.S. under the Obama administration entered a nuclear deal. That was in 2015. And by 2018, the Trump administration had withdrawn from that nuclear deal. And by withdrawing from that nuclear deal, the events with Iran, the tensions, the military conflict began soon after. The minute we withdrew, there was a low-intensity war. Iranian-backed Iraqi militias started to attack U.S. interests. And finally, as a result, Trump ordered the USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier group, to the Gulf, or I should say off the coast of Iran, as a way of pressuring it. B-52s were deployed. And in 2020, Trump ordered a drone strike that killed an Iranian general on Iraqi soil. That's the opening salvo of the war. It was a choreographed retaliation where the Islamic Republic hit back, and then the war kind of ended. But nevertheless, the tensions never really went away, bringing us to the events in 2026.
We've heard many comparisons to the forever wars, again, of Iraq and Afghanistan. And you write about how San Diego County is shaped by those wars. Tell me about that.
Correct, on two levels. First, you have veterans, and I've had students who served in both Afghanistan and Iraq. You have veterans, particularly outside of Camp Pendleton and Oceanside, that have been deployed on multiple tours. Yet at the same time, the Forever Wars sent a whole generation of Iraqis to El Cajon. At San Diego State, you have a whole generation of Iraqis that had to leave Iraq due to those forever wars. You have a whole generation of Afghans sense. And it wouldn't be surprising if you have a new generation of Iranians coming to San Diego as well. And, God forbid, a whole generation of another generation of people who had to go and be mobilized to fight in Iran.
And for, those who have lived through those wars, what does watching this war mean, particularly for veterans and their families?
It's tragic because it's just another example of the US not learning from its history in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were very long, costly wars. And in both cases, the Taliban survived in Afghanistan. They ended up coming back, raising questions for those who died in Afghanistan. What was the point? And in the case of Iraq, Saddam was overthrown and something much more nefarious emerged in its place, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, which still exists. I think those are both cautionary tales that usually wars don't necessarily make Iraq or Afghanistan better or safer. And same could be said of Iran.
We say that that is, a goal, a stated goal in many cases. But that doesn't happen, as you just mentioned. What do you think the goal is?
Well, that's the problem. The goal hasn't been articulated. In 2003, it was to remove Saddam Hussein and create a democratic system in Iraq, as well as to remove weapons of mass destruction that never existed. In Afghanistan, it was to overthrow the Taliban, make sure it was never a base for terrorism. Currently, as we speak, ISIS, one of its branches, is in Afghanistan. Iraq never had WMDs. And so that raises the question. I don't think we have been told as a public. We haven't been provided any evidence. What is the goal in Iran, and why is the U.S. engaging in another war with us? The war hasn't even been declared in official discourse. It's called a strategic action.
Hmm. And how does the rhetoric being used to justify this war reflect what we've heard in previous conflicts?
Well, remember, you had me once before where I described how back in 2003, my research was plagiarized. My research on the 91 Gulf War
Hmm.
was plagiarized for the 2003 Iraq War, using the language that if we don't stop Saddam now, a nuclear mushroom cloud will be detonated in New York City. And so it just is eerily reminiscent, the same arguments, the same, if we don't attack Iran now, a nuclear weapon or an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, could hit the US. So I'm seeing kind of a cycle. And again, it seems that the intelligence is being fabricated as it was in 2003, arguing that a nuclear threat from Iraq was imminent when such program didn't even exist in Iraq. Which then raises the question, is the intelligence being fabricated again in this war? It's happened again. It wouldn't surprise me. If it happened in the past, it wouldn't surprise me if it happens again.
Yeah. So from where you sit, what do you think America has to gain from war?
Uh, it has nothing to gain from war in this respect. In 1991, we ejected Iraq from Kuwait,
Hmm.
not realizing that a decade later, almost a decade later to the date, in 2001, a group called Al Qaeda had formed to object to what we did in Iraq. Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, retaliated against the US for its role in attacking Iraq in 1991. That was a decade later. Who would have thought that would happen? 2003, we replaced Saddam Hussein with a government that took a long time to stabilize and created ISIS in the process. So it begs the question, all those wars were short.
Hmm.
91 Gulf War, 6 weeks. 2003 Iraq War, 3 weeks. But then the repercussions were felt almost a decade later. Trump promises that this might be a 4 week war, but I could guarantee there will be ramifications that we can't even fathom or imagine that might come back to hit the US. There's a term called blowback invented by a UCSD professor. Who knows what the blowback will be?
Mm. And, while you say America doesn't have anything to gain from this, I guess the better question then is who benefits from war?
Well, really, if we look at all the wars in the Middle East, whether it was the intervention of Libya in 2011, that left Libya that, broke apart and collapsed. No actor in the Middle East will benefit from a collapse of Iran. For Israel to take part in this war, I'll just give another precedent. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, it was to eject a group called the Palestine Liberation Organization. It succeeded, but in its place became something much more challenging to Israel's security. Hezbollah emerged in that vacuum. So that even if you could say, does even Israel benefit from this military action? Again, it's with the Middle East. There's always unintended consequences. Never can there be military action that can basically say, okay, this objective was achieved without looking at repercussions a decade later. Desires for vengeance, revenge. These are strong, emotions that just don't disappear when the bullets stop.
Mm. I also want to talk about how this war is different. We're in a completely new era characterized by deep fakes and AI. How is that technology changing the landscape?
Absolutely. In 2003, the blog had just been invented. The personal weblog had just been invented. And in those days, you had Iraqis blogging, telling us how the situation really is. And that was about it. There was no social media back then. Uh, Here we are in 2026. Not only is there social media, but the AI deepfake was quite powerful during the 12-day war. That is the war with Israel and the US, creating videos of either Tel Aviv being destroyed or mushroom clouds in Iran. And those videos went viral. They got millions of likes. My plagiarism was research. My research was plagiarized by the British government because it was the governments creating the propaganda war back then. In this day and age, the propaganda war is decentralized. Anyone can create an AI video that could go viral. And you're based at San Diego State, and this is why kind of new majors like the Bachelor's of Science in AI and human responsibility is so important. It's us who have to be responsible and make sure to ask ourselves, how is the information we're getting about this war real, or is it spreading disinformation? Those are the more powerful weapons than the aircraft carriers I described earlier. Those are weapons that could spread to millions of people.
Hmm. And I understand you're also teaching a class about media and conflict in the Middle East. What lessons are you taking from what's happening in the Middle East right now?
Correct. It was quite surreal. In the summer, I was teaching a course on media in the Middle East for the School of Journalism and Media Studies while the war was happening. In other words, we were just examining the media that was being produced and analyzing it critically. And unfortunately, this war is going to give me, a lot of material for, a class I would offer in the fall on that subject. And it's this, even though Iran might be the military power that's weaker in this, that the ability to create viral media, AI media, becomes a way of asymmetric warfare. It becomes a way of fighting a techno guerrilla war. The fact that it could be losing militarily, but its ability to create images of it striking, let's say, Israel or striking US military, such as aircraft carriers or downing planes, could shape an environment where Iran wins the war for hearts and minds in the region.
Hmm. Wow, lots to discuss and lots to also discuss in terms of what comes next in this war. I'm sure we'll have that discussion as things unfold. I've been speaking with Ebrahim Al-Marashi. He's a professor of Middle East history at Cal State San Marcos and visiting professor of journalism at San Diego State University. And you can read his op-ed in the San Diego Union Tribune, and it will also be linked on our website, kpbs.org. Professor, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Up next, we explore the role Christian nationalism is playing in U.S. policy. KPBS Midday Edition returns after the break.
KPBS Roundtable offers perspectives from those telling San Diego stories. Join us for weekly conversations with reporters and storytellers, adding depth and context to the headlines driving the news in the San Diego region. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to KPBS Midday Edition. I'm Jade Hindman. On Friday, several pastors surrounded and laid hands on President Donald Trump in the Oval Office. With heads bowed, they prayed for him and the war in Iran, while closing that prayer with parts of the Pledge of Allegiance, a clear erasure of the separation between church and state there. In the past, presidents have met with groups of interfaith leaders, but this was mainly a group of evangelical leaders, which is important to note because some of them are leading voices in the Christian nationalist movement, a movement that has heavily influenced U.S. policy under Trump. And that brings us to current military operations in Iran. You see, last week, reports started to surface of troops allegedly being told the reason for bombing Iran was to start a holy war, sanctioned by God to bring forth Armageddon. While unverified allegations, they still track. Joining us to explore why is Rebecca Bartel. She's a professor of religion at San Diego State University. Professor, welcome to Midday Edition.
Hi, Jade. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. You know, last week, a religious freedom group says it received more than 100 complaints from U.S. troops. They allege that commanders are framing this war as part of God's plan and invoking end times rhetoric. So my first question for you is, can you explain what they're talking about here?
Sure. So this is something that scholars refer to as dispensational premillennialism or millenarianism. It's an actually fairly old and kind of prevalent idea within a lot of evangelical Christian, especially in the United States, movements. And there are multiple sort of interpretations of what this means. It's based on biblical interpretation of primarily the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the Christian Bible in the New Testament. And the idea is that there are signs and symbols of the times that would indicate the second coming of Christ. So this is a really common belief within most Protestant Christian sects or traditions, and of which there are many variations. But the idea is that Christ will come again, and the indication that Christ will come again is times of turbulence and turmoil and trial, and the eventual defeat of the so-called beast, which is named as sort of a code for general evil. And then Christ will reign for 1,000 years, and the descendants of Christ will be saved in, a different, any manner of ways to interpret that. So that God works through these times of warfare. And I should mention that this word Armageddon is being thrown around. Armageddon in the book of Revelation is mentioned once, and it's actually probably a place that was referred to by the writer of the book of Revelation, who, at most biblical scholars, and I'm not one, I'm an anthropologist of Christianity, but most biblical scholars agree that this was written by someone who was writing in the time of Emperor Nero, who is, in the first century after the death of Christ, was persecuting early Christians, and it was a time of much turmoil. And so this idea of millenarianism has arisen over different periods of time, and especially the United States, with this movement of Christian nationalism that has been prominent since really the 19th century as kind of a prevalent component of U.S. Christian identity and ideas that has a variation within it. But I think what we're hearing from these reports to the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, these complaints that are allegedly coming in, is a sort of strand of American religious propaganda that this regime is also sort of upholding as a form of justification of all kinds of violence that are part of the foreign policy and domestic policy of this particular administration.
Right. Well, I want to unpack a lot of that because we hear these terms thrown around often: Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism, for example. What's the difference there?
Great question. So Christian nationalism is the Pew Research Center, which I don't know if you're familiar, they do some really good survey work on sort of religious landscapes around the world, especially the United States. And they suggest that around 3 out of 10 American Christians would identify in some way as Christian nationalists, which is a softening of the distinction between church and state, that the different ideas of how much influence Christian morality should have in our legal systems, in our political structures, how much the Bible should be a blueprint for, or the Christian Bible specifically, for writing laws and for influencing the ways in which we think of things like the family, gender, sex, education, the reproductive rights, and so on. Also, that the idea that the United States is an inherently Christian nation. This is sort of central to Christian nationalism, and that the United States has been chosen by God in some sort of a metaphysical way to represent to the rest of the world a kind of not just American exceptionalism, but a chosen kind of role in international affairs, and that the Christianity is sort of the if not should be the official religion, which would be like a straightforward theocratic agenda. It certainly should be the model to which the U.S. government organizes itself and its laws. Christian Zionism is a little bit different. I would say not all Christian nationalists are Christian Zionists, but all Christian Zionists are Christian nationalists to some degree. The Christian Zionist movement has its roots in also sort of over the course of Christian history, different moments of emerging. The idea being that there are, again, based on sort of biblical interpretation of prophetic tracts, that Christ's coming again is ushered in by the Jewish people, all the Jewish diaspora, all regrouping and returning to Palestine or the Holy Land or the Promised Land. And that as the descendants of Abraham, this is taken from Genesis, Ezekiel, some of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible texts, and that's used to justify this. If we have the Jewish folk back in Palestine, quite literally, this is the beginning of the ushering in of this Christian millenarianism, and that will usher in a time of the great battle between good and evil, where ultimately Christ will return. Now, it's important to note that even though Christian Zionists, like someone like Mike Huckabee, is an open and self-declared Christian Zionist, believing that this land, this territory of the Middle East, is prophesied to be inherited by the descendants of Abram, including the Jewish people. But at the end of the day, and a Christian Zionist agenda is ultimately quite anti-Semitic, because it's not the Jewish people who are going to be saved at the end of the day. It is the Christians. And I think that's a really important note to keep in mind when this term is being trotted out as a pro-Jewish idea.
Can you point to just 3 examples of how these ideas have shaped U.S. policy?
In the last,
couple of years. So we'll say 2 years.
Couple of years.
I'll give you 2. Yeah.
I think we see it in all kinds of domestic policy, for example. I mean, it's important to note that just the last few years is a specific iteration of Christian nationalist agenda building. And I think it's important to understand that this has been a long-standing tradition in U.S. evangelical Christianity since the sort of mid-19th century. And it rears its head in all kinds of ways, especially in moments of tense international relations and domestic relations. So I think the repeal of Roe v. Wade, certainly in Christian nationalist circles, the language and discourse and sort of celebration of that is often lauded as a manifestation of this government, this administration, the Trump administration specifically, serving the interests and purposes of a really sort of conservative Christian evangelical agenda. And when I do also want to say Christian evangelical, I'm really talking about white Christian evangelicals, and there is diversity within Christian evangelical identity, and but we're talking like 86% of white Christian nationalists, according to Pew, could be categorized as Christian nationalists by some degree. I think also the border policies that we're seeing implemented in such violent ways, and the anti-immigration movement, the idea that this is tied to a religious identity and that folks from outside the US threaten the sort of purity of a white Christian US identity. So we're seeing that manifest in border policy, in ICE action, in the policies of DHS. And the messaging that's going on, if you follow at the DHS, DOD, any of these government institutions on social media, for example, you can see really blatant religious propaganda being utilized to justify the actions of government agents. And of course, moving the embassy in Israel to Bethlehem, at Jerusalem, as a that was a move to satisfy a certain specific lobby that was pushing for this kind of agenda in Middle Eastern presence of the United States via its proxy through Israel. So those are three sort of concrete examples, I think, of how we're seeing this manifest. I do want to say, though, if I may,
sure,
that this is not the only story, and I think the more attention and credence we give to Christian nationalism, these sort of extreme, I wouldn't call it a fringe movement, but it's definitely not the only or dominant story within the Christian world in the United States. And I want anyone who's listening thinking this is not the Christianity that I identify with, to be assured that they're right. This is one manifestation of a really particular conservative agenda within the electorate that's also tied to a military interest, political interest, and essentially, relations of power that all religion can really exploit.
Well, I want to turn back now to those reports from service members because USA Today looked into them, and the Pentagon did not respond to their questions about whether they've investigated or verified those complaints. But they did hear from retired military chaplains about overt Christian messaging under Pete Hegseth. What are the potential consequences there that you see?
I think there's a real potential for violations of religious freedom to begin with. So violations of constitutional rights of a diverse military community that represents all kinds of different religious positions and traditions, which is, I think, one of the fundamental principles of constitutional democracy in the United States. I also think it weakens credibility of this government and the military campaign in the eyes of so many in the world. I mean, I'm Canadian. I'm not a U.S. citizen, and from the perspective of thinking about U.S. foreign policy as being driven through this theological kind of justification, it really will continue to cause increasing issues in international collaboration and relations. I think it's not something to be taken seriously on the world stage.
Wow. Well, in the last minute before we go here, what can we learn from history in this moment?
I think there are a couple of things. One of them is that religion is not something that exists sui generis outside of historical, political, economic, social context. It is something that is shaped and formed by human beings that just make decisions about the language and the practices and the discourses and the actions that they justify or use religion as a way of convincing the electorate. I think there are so many historical moments where we see religion being deployed as a weapon that can be just as deadly as bombs. And at the same time, though, I think we need to also recognize that religion can also be utilized for resistance and peace building and collective ideas of what is just and right in the world. One of the things that also is important to remember is that religion it ebbs and flows. It's not a static thing. So there are always movements coming and going that are given more or less importance in the public sphere. So we need to remember that.
All right. Thank you so much. I've been speaking with Rebecca Bartel. She's a professor of religion at San Diego State University. Rebecca, such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks for joining us today. If you missed anything, you can download KPBS Midday Edition on all podcast apps. I'm Jade Hindman. Join me again tomorrow. Until then, make it a great day on purpose, everyone.
Hola friends, the Tijuana and San Diego borderlands are brimming with captivating stories of people whose lives are shaped by the connection between Mexico and the U.S. On the Port of Entry podcast, we delve into those stories. Listen to Port of Entry wherever you get your podcasts.